I cover disappearing cities for a living, which is a strange way to end up writing about the most beautiful country I have ever seen. My name is Marcus Fontenot. I grew up in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans, in a house my grandmother bought with money she saved working 2 jobs, on a street that sits, on a good day, about a meter below sea level. I was 11 when Hurricane Katrina put 8 feet of water through that house. I remember the specific sound the water made moving through the walls, a sound I still cannot fully describe to people who didn't hear it. My grandmother rebuilt. Most of our neighbors didn't come back at all. I became a journalist, eventually, because I wanted to understand why some low-lying places drown and others don't, and because I kept hearing the same sentence. From engineers, from disaster researchers, from a professor who supervised my first serious reporting project. If you want to understand what we got wrong, go look at the Netherlands. They've been having this exact fight for 800 years, and somehow, they keep winning it. I want to be honest about what I expected to find there. I expected engineering seawalls, pumps, the hard technical apparatus of a country refusing to drown. What I did not expect was that the very thing making the Netherlands one of the most photographed, most impossibly picturesque countries on Earth, the windmills, the canals, the flower-lined water villages that look almost too composed to be real, would turn out to be the same fight, wearing a different face. I went looking for infrastructure. I found out that in the Netherlands, the infrastructure and the beauty are not two different things. They never were. I started in a village that, from the air, looks less like a real place than like something a production designer built for a film and then forgot to strike. Giethoorn sits in the northeastern province of Overijssel, and it does not have roads. Not limited roads, no roads at all through its historic center, no cars, nothing but a network of hand-dug canals, footpaths, and more than 100 small wooden footbridges connecting one grass islet to the next. Thatched roof farmhouses sit right at the waterline. The only traffic is the soft electric hum of what locals call whisper boats, gliding tourists and residents alike between houses that have stood in roughly this configuration since the 18th century. The story of how it got this way is not, as I'd assumed, a story about aesthetics. It's a story about peat. In the 13th century, settlers found the area's waterlogged ground littered with the horns of goats that had drowned in a catastrophic regional flood a few decades earlier. A flood so severe it gave the village its name, from an old Dutch phrase referring to those goat horns. What those settlers found beneath the surface was even more consequential than the horns. Dense layers of peat, a valuable fuel source in a country with almost no timber or coal of its own. For centuries, communities here dug that peat out of the ground by hand, and every time they did, they left behind a long, narrow trench that filled with water. Dig enough peat over enough generations, and eventually the trenches outnumber the solid ground. The canals of Giethoorn were never designed by an architect chasing a postcard image. They are simply what's left over after a community spent 500 years extracting the one resource the ground actually had to offer. When cars arrived in the 20th century, and every other village in the Netherlands was widening its lanes to accommodate them, Giethoorn's residents did something almost nobody else did. They voted, collectively, to keep their center exactly as it was. Not because they couldn't afford automobiles, a local guide told me almost defensively, correcting an assumption I hadn't quite said out loud, but because there was simply nowhere to put a car once you arrived. Parking lots exist now on the outskirts of town, and everyone walks or boats in from there. The village chose inconvenience, deliberately, generation after generation, because the alternative was losing the exact configuration of water and land that had defined it since the peat diggers first started their work. I stood on one of those footbridges near dusk, watching a resident pole a small boat home with a bag of groceries balanced across the bow, and thought about how differently we'd handled an analogous decision back home. New Orleans, too, is a landscape substantially reshaped by extraction in our case, the draining of wetlands and the leveeing of the Mississippi, done in the name of progress and convenience, without the same collective, generations-long willingness to accept the inconvenience that might have kept the natural water buffers around the city intact. Geethorn kept its canals because the community decided, together, that convenience wasn't worth what it would cost. I don't think anyone in Louisiana was ever offered that same collective choice, cleanly, at the moment it mattered. The next stop made the stakes of that choice considerably less quaint. Roughly 25 kilometers southeast of Rotterdam, in a polder called the Alblasserwaard, stand 19 windmills that most people who've never been to the Netherlands could probably still picture without help. Tall, brick or thatch-clad structures with enormous sail arms, arranged in 2 long rows along parallel canals, photographed so often that the image has become close to a national logo. What almost nobody pictures correctly is what they were actually built to do, or how little choice the region had in building them. More than a quarter of the Netherlands sits at or below sea level. The Alblasserwaard is among the lowest of it. Old peat bog that, once drained centuries ago to make it farmable, began doing what drained peat always does, oxidizing, compacting, and sinking, year after year, ever further below the level of the rivers running directly alongside it. Left alone, water would simply pour back downhill into the polder and never leave. The 19 windmills of Kinderdijk, built around 1740, existed to solve exactly one problem: lift water that wanted to flow one direction and force it to flow the other, continuously, for as long as anyone wanted the land beneath them to stay dry enough to farm. They are not, as I'd naively assumed before arriving, decommissioned relics kept around for tourists. They are still fully operational, maintained by the local water authority as a genuine emergency backup to the electric pumping stations that now do the daily work. During the Second World War, when fuel shortages left the modern diesel pumps unable to run, these 18th century windmills were put back into full service and kept the polder dry through the entire occupation, doing the exact job they'd been built for 2 centuries earlier, without modification. A UNESCO plaque now describes the whole ensemble, mills, dikes, canals, and pumping stations together as a single continuously operating water management system, inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 1997, not for its appearance but for what conservators called its outstanding demonstration of human ingenuity in the ongoing battle against water. I spoke with a water board engineer named Sanne Verhoeven, who monitors this stretch of the polder system and who has spent a significant part of her career studying flood control comparisons between the Netherlands and other low-lying regions around the world, including, she mentioned before I'd brought it up myself, the American Gulf Coast. She said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything else I heard on the entire trip. The windmills are beautiful, everyone agrees on that. But they are only beautiful because they worked. A machine that fails to keep the water out doesn't get photographed for 400 years. It gets forgotten, or it gets replaced by a memorial to the people who drowned because of it. What you're calling picturesque is actually just the visible record of 800 years of not losing. I asked her, directly, whether she thought a system like this could have prevented what happened to my own city in 2005. She considered the question with more care than I expected and didn't give me the comforting answer. She said, I won't tell you our system would have simply worked there, because the geography, the storm, the funding history, the politics, all of it is different, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise. What I will tell you is that we treat this as a problem that is never finished, that never gets a final victory, and that requires permanent, boring, continuously funded maintenance whether or not a storm is coming that year. I think the places that lose this fight are usually the places that treated the last disaster as the reason to finally fix things, instead of treating every single year, disaster or not, as the reason. I understood what she meant more completely later, standing on top of a 9-kilometer barrier of concrete and steel in the province of Zeeland, built directly in response to the night the Netherlands nearly lost this fight for good. On the night of the 31st of January 1953, a severe northwesterly storm combined with an unusually high spring tide to push a wall of North Sea water over dikes across the southwestern Netherlands that had, in some cases, stood for centuries. Dikes burst in dozens of places, almost all of them in the middle of the night, while people slept. By the time the water receded, more than 1,800 people were dead, over 2,000 square kilometers of land had been submerged, and entire villages in the province of Zeeland had simply ceased to exist as anything but wreckage and mud. It remains, to this day, one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern Dutch history. Within weeks of the disaster, the Dutch government convened an engineering commission and launched what became known as the Delta Works, a multi-decade national project to shorten and fortify the country's entire southwestern coastline, closing off major estuaries with a series of dams and movable storm surge barriers on a scale that had never been attempted anywhere in the world. The largest and most complex piece of that system, the Oosterscheldekering, or Eastern Scheldt Storm Surge Barrier, stretches nearly 9 kilometers between two Zeeland islands. Built on 65 massive concrete piers separated by steel gates that stay open under normal conditions, preserving the natural tidal ecosystem and the region's centuries-old oyster and mussel fisheries, but can be lowered across the entire span in roughly 90 minutes, whenever a dangerous storm surge approaches. It took more than a decade to build, cost billions of dollars, and when it was finally completed in 1986, the reigning monarch, Queen Beatrix, closed it with a sentence, now inscribed at the site. "The storm barrier is closed, the Delta Works are complete, Zeeland is safe." Engineers I spoke with there were careful, almost stubbornly careful, not to describe the barrier as a permanent solution. It's designed to withstand a storm surge, statistically expected to occur only once every 4,000 years, an extraordinary standard, but explicitly not an infinite one, and one now under active reassessment as sea levels continue rising faster than the original 1950s planning models anticipated. The nearby Watersnood Museum, built specifically to preserve the memory of the 1953 flood, exists for a reason. Its own staff were explicit about. An entire generation that lived through that night is now old or gone, and the Dutch government considers forgetting the disaster to be, itself, a genuine long-term risk to the country's safety, because a population that no longer remembers why the barriers exist is a population more likely to someday stop paying to maintain them. I stood at the edge of that barrier for a long time, looking out at the gray line of the North Sea on one side and the calm, tidal water of the protected estuary on the other, thinking about the lower Ninth Ward, about a levee system that had been flagged as inadequate by federal engineers years before Katrina arrived and was funded, repaired, and reinforced only after the water had already taken the neighborhood apart. The Netherlands built a museum specifically so it would never again treat a flood as something to remember only after the next one hit. I'm not sure my own city has finished building that museum yet, in any sense that actually changes how we fund the next 50 years. The last piece of the story is the one that took me longest to understand, because it isn't a structure you can photograph at all. It's an institution, arguably the single most consequential thing I learned on the entire trip, and the thing that finally explained why everything I'd seen up to that point existed in the first place. Long before the Netherlands existed as a unified nation, before there was a Dutch king, a Dutch parliament, or a Dutch constitution, there were water boards, regional bodies, some dating as far back as the 12th and 13th centuries, formed by farmers and landowners who had no king strong enough or interested enough to protect their land from flooding, and who realized, out of sheer necessity, that they would have to organize and fund that protection themselves. The oldest of these, the Hoogheemraadschap van Rijnland, received its founding charter from a regional count in 1248, and is remarkably still operating today, alongside 20 other modern water boards that between them manage the entire country's dikes, canals, pumping stations, and water quality. Historians consider the water boards to be the oldest continuously functioning democratic institutions in the Netherlands, older than its cities' governments, older than its provinces, older, in a meaningful sense, than the idea of the Netherlands as a single country at all. Membership wasn't voluntary in any meaningful way, and neither was participation. Every landowner in a district had a direct stake in whether the dike held, so every landowner was taxed, and, in most cases, entitled to a voice in how the system was run. The medieval principle underlying the entire structure was blunt and unambiguous. Those who do not contribute do not get protected. You could not opt out of the collective effort and still expect the water to respect your particular field. A retired water board administrator I spoke with in Leiden, Willem de Groot, who had spent nearly 4 decades working within this system before retiring, put it more plainly than any academic source I'd read on the subject. He said, "People in other countries sometimes ask us how the Dutch became so good at consensus, at compromise, at what we call the polder model, this idea that opposing political factions sit down and negotiate toward a solution everyone can live with, rather than one side simply winning. I always tell them, we didn't become that way by choice. We became that way because a farmer whose field was 1 meter from the dike and a farmer whose field was 3 kilometers away from it were both going to drown in the same flood if the dike broke, regardless of how much they disliked each other. When your survival is that directly, physically shared, you learn to negotiate, because the alternative to negotiating is that you both go under, together, at the same time." He paused, then added something I've turned over in my mind more than almost anything else from the whole trip. Your country's disaster and ours are not actually that different in what caused the damage. Water doesn't care about property lines. What's different is that we built, centuries before anyone thought to call it infrastructure, a political habit of treating the water as everyone's problem at once, because it genuinely was. I don't know how you build that habit somewhere. It was never allowed to form in the first place. I only know that once you have it, the beautiful things, the windmills, the canals, the barrier that keeps Zealand dry, those are just what's left visible above the surface of 800 years of people agreeing, over and over, generation after generation, that they were not willing to let each other drown. I flew home thinking about my grandmother's rebuilt house, about the sound the water made moving through her walls, about a levee system I now understood differently than I had when I boarded the plane to Amsterdam. Nothing about the Netherlands' geography makes it naturally suited to survive against the sea. If anything, the opposite is true. More of this country should not exist above water than does. What actually exists here is not a lucky landscape. It's the visible residue of a society that decided, roughly 8 centuries ago and every year since, that keeping each other dry was worth more than winning an argument, worth more than short-term convenience, worth funding continuously rather than only after the water had already taken something from someone. That is what nobody told me before I got there. The windmills, the canals, the flower-crowned water villages that look too perfect to be real, none of it is decoration sitting on top of the engineering. It is the engineering. The beauty and the survival system are the exact same object, looked at from 2 different distances. If this story changed how you think about the places that survive rising water and the places that don't, I'd like to know what stayed with you most. Tell me where you're watching from. This narrative is told through the perspective of Marcus Fontenot, a fictional American journalist. All locations, historical facts, and institutions described, including the village of Giethorn and its peat-digging origins, the Kinderdijk windmills, and the Alblasserwaard polder, the North Sea flood of 1953, the Delta Works and the Oosterscheldekering storm surge barrier, and the history of the Dutch waterboards, waterschappen, including the Hoogheemraadschap van Rijnland, are real and described as accurately as possible. Marcus Fontenot, Sanne Verhoeven, Willem de Groot, and their specific conversations are fictional.